Good morning, guys. It's Thursday, March 19th. I will be reading, we have 3 chapters left in Walk Two Moons. I'll be reading 2 of those chapters today. Tomorrow we will finish up our book at 10 a.m., which is probably going to be about the time I upload this video. You will be able to vote for our next book. I put several choices in there with a description of each book, and there is a Google Doc below it where you can select which book. Each person can vote one time. The voting will run through, I'll probably close it a couple of days before fall break. Spring break is over so that I can get a hold of the book. Let's see what else. Mrs. Bullington sent out an email yesterday. Our time off from school has been extended, and starting the Monday, March 30th, if you've been working on packets at home, you can drop off those packets to be turned in and graded. You have to keep up with your work. I am putting grades in daily. Those of you who are taking pictures of your work and sending them to me, great job. Your grades are going in. And those of you who are doing the work packets, I am going to be grading those come Monday. If I have no work from you, I'm putting missings in. And we know missings calculate as zeros. Mrs. Bullington is also giving the option to borrow a Chromebook. So if you don't have a laptop or an iPad or something at home that you're working on, you can borrow one of those. You have to fill out the form today or tomorrow and pick up for that. It's going to be after spring break. In addition, because we're giving everyone the opportunity to do online work, I'm going to step up my online game. Okay, instead of just scanning in worksheets for you guys to do, I am going to have you do Google Forms or Pivot or something where you actually are going to have problems and select them. Remember, we still have to be in testing mode. I've taught you all the standards. So that being said, let's go ahead and read 2 of our last 3 chapters in Walk Two Moons. Okay. All right, chapter 42, The Bus and Willow. Remember yesterday, Sal has taken the car. Graham is very, very sick. She's in the hospital. Graham stayed with her. It's the night before her mother's birthday. Sal has taken the car and driven down to Lewiston and is at an outlook point, and someone came up to her and is talking about the bus wreck, and there was one survivor. Okay? Chapter 42, The Bus and Willow. When the man drove off, I crawled beneath the railing and made my way down the hill toward the bus. In the east, the sky was smoky gray, and I was glad for the approaching dawn. In the year and a half since the trail was hacked out, the brush had begun to grow back. Wet with dew, straggly branches slapped and scratched at my legs and hid uneven ground, so that several times I tripped, tumbling and sliding downward. The bus lay on its side like an old-sick horse, its broken headlights staring out mournfully into the surrounding trees. Most of the huge rubber tires were punctured and grotesquely twisted on their axles. I climbed up on the bus's side, hoping to make my way down to an open window. But there were 2 enormous gashes torn on the side, and the jagged metal was peeled back like a sardine can. Through a smashed window behind the driver's seat, I saw a jumbled mess of twisted seats and chunks of foam rubber. Everything was dusted over with fuzzy green mold. I had imagined that I would drop through a window and walk down the aisle, but there was no space inside to move. I had wanted to scour every inch of the bus, looking for something, anything, that might be familiar. By now the sky was pale pink, and it was easier to find the uphill trail, but harder going as it was a steep incline. By the time I reached the top, I was muddy and scratched from head to toe. It wasn't until I had crawled beneath the railing that I noticed the car parked behind Gramps' red Chevrolet. It was the sheriff. He was talking on his radio when he saw me, and he motioned for his deputy to get out. The deputy said, "We were just about to come down there after you. We saw you up on top of the bus. You kids ought to know better. Why were you down there this time of day anyways?" Before I could answer, the sheriff climbed out of his car. He settled his hat on his head and shifted his holster. "Where are the others?" he said. "There aren't any others," I said. "Who brought you up here?" "Brought myself." "Whose car is this?" "My grandfather's." "And where is he?" The sheriff glanced to the left and right, as if Gramps might be hiding in the bushes. "He's in Coeur d'Alene," the sheriff said. "Pardon?" So I told him about Graham and about how Gramps had to stay with her and about how I had driven from Coeur d'Alene very carefully. The sheriff said, "Now let me get this straight." And he repeated everything I said, ending with, "And you're telling me that you drove from Coeur d'Alene to this spot on the hill all by yourself?" "Very carefully," I said. "My Gramps taught me how to drive, and he taught me to drive very carefully." The sheriff said to the deputy, "I'm afraid to ask this young lady. Exactly how old is she? Why don't you ask her?" The deputy said, "How old are you?" I told him. The sheriff gave me a stern look and said, "I don't suppose you would mind telling me exactly what was so all fired up important that you couldn't wait for someone with a legitimate driver's license to bring you to the fair city of Lewiston." So I told him all the rest. When I had finished, he returned to his car and talked into his radio some more. Then he told me to get into his car, and he told the deputy to follow in Gramps' car. I thought the sheriff was probably going to put me in jail, and it wasn't the thought of jail that bothered me so much. It was knowing that I was this close and might not be able to do what I had come to do. And it was knowing that I needed to get back to Graham. He did not take me to jail, however. He drove me across the bridge into Lewiston, on through the city and up a hill. He drove into Longwood, stopped at the caretaker's house, and went inside. Behind us was the deputy in Gramps' car. The caretaker came out and pointed off to the right, and the sheriff got back in and drove off in that direction. It was a pleasant place. The Snake River curved behind the section, and tall, full-leaved trees grew here and there across the lawn. The sheriff parked the car and led me up a path toward the river, and there, on a little hill overlooking the river and the valley, was my mother's grave. On the tombstone beneath her name and the dates of her birth and death was an engraving of a maple tree. And it was only then, when I saw the stone and her name, Chanhassen Sugar Pickford Hiddle, and the engraving of the tree, that I knew, by myself and for myself, she was not coming back. I asked if I could sit there for a little while, because I wanted to memorize the place. I wanted to memorize the grass and the trees, the smells and the sounds. In the midst of the still morning, with only the sound of the river gurgling by, I heard a bird. It was singing a bird song, a true, sweet bird song. I looked all around and then up in the willow that leaned toward the river. The bird song came from the top of the willow, and I did not want to look too closely, because I wanted it to be the tree that was singing. I kissed the willow. "Happy birthday," I said. In the sheriff's car, I said, "She isn't actually gone at all. She's singing in the trees." "Whatever you say, Miss Salamanca Hiddle." You can take me to jail now. Chapter 43, Our Gooseberry. Instead of taking me to jail, the sheriff drove me to Coeur d'Alene with the deputy following us in Gramps' car. The sheriff gave me a lengthy and severe lecture about driving without a license, and he made me promise that I would not drive again until I was 16. "Not even on Gramps' farm?" I said. He looked straight ahead at the road. "I suppose people are going to do whatever they want on their own farms," he said, "as long as they have a lot of room to maneuver and as long as they are not endangering the lives of any other persons or animals. But I'm not saying you ought to. I'm not giving you permission or anything." I asked him to tell me about the bus accident. When I asked him if he had been there that night and if he had seen anyone brought out of the bus, he said, "You don't want to know that. A person shouldn't have to think about those things." "Did you see my mother?" "I saw a lot of people, Salamanca, and maybe I saw your mother and maybe I didn't. But I'm sorry to say that if I did see her, I didn't know her. I remember your father coming into the station. I do remember that. But I wasn't there when—" "Did you see Mrs. Cadaver?" I said. "How did you know about Mrs. Cadaver?" he said. "Of course I saw Mrs. Cadaver. Everyone saw Mrs. Cadaver. 9 hours after the bus rolled over, all those stretchers were being carried up the hill, and everyone despairing. There was her hand coming up out of the window, and everyone was shouting because there it was, a moving hand." He glanced at me. "I wished it had been your mother's hand." "Mrs. Cadaver was sitting next to my mother," I said. "Oh." They were strangers to each other when they got off that bus, but by the time they got off 6 days later, they were friends. My mother told Mrs. Cadaver all about me and my father and our farm in By Banks. She told Mrs. Cadaver about the fields and the blackberries and Moody Blue and the chickens and the singing tree. I think that if she told Mrs. Cadaver all that, then my mother must have been missing us, don't you think? I'm sure of it, the sheriff said. And how do you know all of this? So I explained to him how Mrs. Cadaver had told me all of this on the day that Phoebe's mother had returned. Mrs. Cadaver told me about how my father had visited her in the hospital in Lewiston after he had buried my mother. He came to see the only survivor from the bus crash, and when he learned that Mrs. Cadaver had been sitting next to my mother, they started talking about her. They talked for 6 hours. Mrs. Cadaver told me about her and my father writing to each other, and about how my father needed to get away from By Banks for a while. I asked Mrs. Cadaver why my father hadn't told me how he had met her, and she said that he had tried, but I didn't want to hear it, and he didn't want to upset me. He thought I might dislike Margaret because she had survived and my mother had not. Do you love him? I had asked Mrs. Cadaver. Are you going to marry him? Goodness, she said. It's a little early for that. He's holding on to me because I was with your mother and held her hand in her last moments. Your father isn't ready to love anyone else yet. Your mother was one of a kind. That's true. She was. And even though Mrs. Cadaver had told me all of this, and had told me how she had been with my mother in her last minutes, I still did not believe that my mother was actually dead. I still thought that there might have been a mistake. I did not know what I hoped to find in Lewiston. Maybe I expected that I would see her walking through a field, and I would call to her, and she would say, "Oh, Salamanca, my left arm," and "Oh, Salamanca, take me home." I slept for the last 50 miles into Coeur d'Alene, and when I awoke, I was sitting in the sheriff's car outside the hospital entrance. The sheriff was coming out of the hospital. He handed me an envelope and slid in beside me on the seat. In the envelope was a note from Gramps, giving the name of the motel he was staying at. Beneath that, he had written, "I am so sorry to say that our gooseberry died at 3 o'clock this morning." Gramps was sitting on the side of the bed in the motel, talking on the phone. When he saw me and the sheriff at the door, he put the phone down and hugged me to him. The sheriff told Gramps how sorry he was and that he didn't think it was the time or place to give anybody a lecture about underage granddaughters driving down a mountainside in the middle of the night. He handed Gramps his car keys and asked Gramps if he needed help making any arrangements. Gramps said he had taken care of most things. Gramps' body was being flown back to By Banks, where my father would meet the plane. Gramps and I were going to finish what had to be done in Coeur d'Alene and leave the next morning. After the sheriff and his deputy left, I noticed Gramps' open suitcase. Inside were Gramps' things, all mixed in with Gramps' clothes. I picked up her baby powder and smelled it. On the desk was a crumpled letter. When Gramps saw me look at it, he said, "I wrote her a letter last night. It's a love letter." Remember, Gramps went to the Eggman because he had written her a love letter and Gramps never had. Gramps lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. "Chickabiddy," he said, "I miss my gooseberry." He put one arm over his eyes. The other hand patted the empty space beside him. "This ain't," he said. "This ain't." "It's okay," I said. I sat down on the other side of the bed and held his hand. "This ain't your marriage bed." After about 5 long minutes, Gramps cleared his throat and said, "But it will have to do." All right, guys, we have 1 chapter left. I'm going to post some comments underneath of the video. I've been doing that each day to get the conversation going. Comment below and tell me what you think about these chapters that we read today. All right, guys, bye. See you tomorrow.